Okay, I think I'm going to start now. So, thanks for joining. I know this is like the last day, last session of the day. So, thanks for sticking around. So, my name is Manish Dave, and the topic here is on policies. So, this is, as the topic suggests, getting real with policies. So, it's more on the use cases and from an end user perspective, and I'll walk through what I'm going to talk about. So a little bit about myself. I've been with Intel IT. So I'm from the IT organization, the user side of the part of the ODL, or actually for the whole thing, not from the engineering side. I just want to call out that part, right? So overall, my work has been mostly focused on network security for many years. But recently doing a lot of work for our internal cloud transformation, right? And some of my areas of interest, I can talk about. One is obviously the software defined. The second one is self-service governance and policy management. So I've done some work on these areas. There's some internal work we had done, and this is what basically today's talk is based on the experience that I had from there. And then there's a granular-based trust policy. You can look it up. There's some other work we have done. And then here's my email and things like that. So basically, I'm going to cover it's just into 3 sections. The first section is going to be, the background on why infrastructure policies, what do they mean, from an end user perspective, why we use them, and how they are implemented today. Okay. The second one is going to be more about real world use cases. So this is going to be examples of policies that we are implementing that are required. And again, I try to capture as many as I can to get a glimpse of the whole thing. But just to clarify, these are more top of mind kind of use cases and examples, not meant to be a comprehensive. Even though I think of maybe that's a interesting work would be for the community. Maybe at some point we'll do that. But this was just top of mind. What I can think of from an enterprise IT perspective, right? And then the third section is more about, what is happening. So the talk before this, you saw the intent, right? And then there's other work happening. I will cover a little bit of that. But more importantly, where I think, the community need to focus and where I see, that work need to happen. Again, coming from my perspective as an end user, right? So having said that, so let me start with the first section. So why infrastructure policy? So basically, infrastructure policies have always existed. This is where I'm coming from, right? So they have always existed. The business logic and policies have always been there for infrastructure, and I'll get into real examples for that. But idea is, the infrastructure is not itself an end; it's a means to an end, right? Your end of the day. Even if you're an infrastructure provider, you're running because of revenue or whatever, right? If you're an application, if you're a business, then you're running the infrastructure. There is always rules, business rules, logic, business logic, security requirements, what have you, right? Have always been associated with infrastructure. And so far, what has happened is humans, they're interpreting. This is so far happening today, right? You're interpreting them, and then you're applying them to the infrastructure individual elements, right? And then the third part, which is really important part of policy, is you're doing manual governance and audit for compliance. And again, I'll get into real examples for those. But the idea is, this is not a foreign concept. It's not coming out of nowhere, right? So we have been doing this for many years. So this is, from my view, this is kind of like how I see the path the infrastructure is taking. So, even my own experience, last 15 years, maybe 15 years ago, I saw most of the workload was happening, bare metal. You're building you're building the network, you're connecting something, you're building the operating system, you're running the application, installing the application, running the application, developing it. You're managing each of these individually and so on and so forth, right? From there, we went into, reason I'm calling this current is pretty much, at least from my world, this is where I'm mostly at. I'm moving on to the next one, which is software defined, but the current is the whole virtualization and cloud, right? Over here, the 2 important things happen, right? One is a self-service, right? So suddenly, think of this, from the context of policy as we come into next level, right? Suddenly now you have the need for, the self-service. So the operations person or team or somebody who was in the loop for doing some part of the infrastructure provisioning or doing whatever, right? Is slowly it's getting automated and becoming in. So that was one of the structure for the virtualization in the cloud, right? The second thing is, from a security perspective, you will always hear this, right? Hey, virtualization cloud, how do you secure? There's like so many angles to it, but from a security perspective, it somewhat made job harder for the security, and I'll get into examples for that, right? And then the current what we're doing right now with ODL, with OpenStack, the whole community is working on the software defined, right? And what I'm saying is from now on, I mean, moving forward, maybe many years from now or wherever we get that, and we're working on this right now, but next is once we have the software layer to manage the infrastructure, then it's all going to be, how you're managing the intelligence on top of that, and that's where the policy is going to come in, right? And I'm not saying policy as a service is the only thing which will work on top of that, but there's going to be applications and like for example, the talk before the intent and those sort of things, right? So then you are worried less about the infrastructure itself because it's the software which is managing it, the layer. So that's anyway the high level view. So, and then I want to jump into a real quick, couple of again, this section was just to, get you grounded on like, what the general area of policy as far as the infrastructure for an enterprise IT is concerned. So the problem statement is, so the biggest thing is, with software defined, things are moving faster, more pace and all that. So the manual workflows for policies, they don't work, okay? So you actually cannot scale with the, you cannot scale with the needs, you cannot, meet the pace and demand. So I have some horror story example, like, if today, if I come up with some need for where it is a highly secure, workload that I have to have like 20 different controls and I have to prove that I've done those 20 different controls, I have to go through like, takes many, many days of reviews and, checklists and whatever, right? And if you really think about it, what the world we are getting into is, it's like, you're in minutes, maybe, sometime, whatever time it takes for infrastructure to spin up whatever you need. So, so it doesn't just go together, right? I mean, you cannot just wait for someone to go and approve and review and, do certain things, So anyway, so that's one problem, right? The lack of automation. The second one is, the whole, manual governance and compliance is error prone. I mean, this is there today also. So in a way, it's an opportunity for us to improve. It's very cumbersome, it's very error prone, especially when you come to, security compliance and things like that. And then the opportunity is, so one of the biggest opportunity for any software-defined infrastructure or software-defined networking is, it's going to give you the business agility. That's one of the things. But the benefit here or opportunity here is how do you do with policies, with compliance, so making sure that you're delivering the value, but you're delivering it with the requirement of the security or the business requirement, and how you're folding them into the needs of running application on the infrastructure. And then there has been a lot of, in the past, work done on, at least in the research area and general, work done on self-defending infrastructure, self-healing infrastructure or applications and all that. So I think this is the time where we are really coming to that, and I'll explain some examples of this, right? But this is the time where, the infrastructure can actually start doing some of that, and that's where the policies will come. So those are the opportunities I can think of. So moving on, so the next, I want to sort of put some example of, what do you mean by policy? So this is where I'll start getting into some real, like, so far it was like top level, but so when I say policy, I have like, there could be multiple layers, but I'm thinking of, this is like, let's start on the top. You're going to say, more like, the human language, English or whatever language is spoken, right? You're saying, okay, I want this to happen in my infrastructure. So I want, only strategic vendor to have access, or I want, all my web traffic should be, encrypted, things like that, right? The next level is the actual policy language where you're talking about, okay, now my firewall, so this is where some of the work that's happening right now at ODL and some of the other places, okay, I need to permit this traffic, I need to whitelist this servers, or I can allow only this specific traffic. I mean, those are examples for security. But then you also have like, in a VPN example, maybe, some, over here I don't have an example for a resource, but you might have a resource policy or a QoS example, things like that. And then the next level is the infrastructure level, which is your actually configuration for your infrastructure. At the end, it's going to get translated to the individual elements, right? So whether it's, if you talk about network, then whether it's like your open flow, OVSDB configuration, whatever it is, right? So, or if it's other service element, if it's a really firewall, then it has its own, configuration language or whatever element is. So that's kind of the one concept I wanted to get in. The second one is getting into this, what I call the life cycle. So when you think of policy, and when I'm thinking it from a, overall, I have a policy for how to run my applications or how my infrastructure should behave. And I am thinking of it as a whole life cycle. So I have definition of the policy, so I'm able to define the policy. In other words, I'm just telling what the policies are. And this is not static, by the way. This keeps changing because if something, because business conditions change, rules and regulations change, law changes, or just my needs change, right? So I might adjust this policy. So it's not static, right? So it's not set in time and forget it. It's the definition itself a good. I mean, it's an ongoing process. The next is the consume. So this is where again the example of the intent and some of those come in, right? Where the consume is now you have a policies which are described. And now you're going to use your infrastructure. So, this is where the application will use it or something else would use it, right? The third one is how you enforce. So basically you're enforcing the application, the policies on the infrastructure, right? And then finally is the audit. This is the most important part, according to me, which needs to happen and which, we need to do some more work here is, now that I have a set of rules that my infrastructure should behave, whatever it is, I have made sure that my applications are using it. I have made sure that enforcement is happening. I should be able to prove it, auditability. And this may not be needed for all use cases, but it's a must-have for certain use cases. Okay, and I have the sort of like a four, like in at least in a traditional or even an IT department or any kind of organization, you will have the governance separated from the audit, separated from the developer, from the operations. But as more and more, these are just how it is right now. But for example, the developers and operations might, get together more and more. This is the whole DevOps and things like that, right? But I'm just showing that the four roles are usually separate in a typical organization, right? So the next concept I want to bring in was really about the policy themselves are not coming from a single source, what I call the policy stakeholders, right? So you probably heard other people talk about this. So I have here, just some examples, like you have some security regulatory requirements, you have operational constraints, you have business requirements, right? You have the infrastructure capability. I want to do certain things on my infrastructure, but what if it's not able to support it, right? So you need to have the infrastructure capability. The operation, the intent, the application developer itself, and so on and so forth. So what happens in the real world is, when this type of things come up, there's multiple stakeholder, they get and close to each other, and then they get in a meeting, whatever they have to do to communicate, they talk it out, and they communicate, and then they resolve the conflicts, they negotiate, they do all that. Now, when we get into this automation of the policy, we have to define and describe all the or have these capabilities so you can do all this. So again, I was sitting through the previous talk, they talk about the conflict resolution, right? That's a great example, right? So it was, okay, so I have two policies which are, either they are not, clear enough, or there is ambiguity, or there is some overlap. How do you resolve, right? So this is kind of like, multiple right, or whatever you want to call it, right? It's like it's coming from multiple stakeholder. You want to then resolve, because at the end of the day, you're, describing what you want to do. And then I'm going to just spend a little bit quick time on this. This is like, the four things I think what would happen for the policy. First is automation. I've already described it. Self-service, okay? So I'm not going to wait for somebody to do this, right? The rules are there. I just submit my workload. I need to make sure that it's following the rules, and then it goes into automation, right? So that's sort of the whole concept of automation. The abstraction, again, I touched upon that in that the slide before where I said, there's multiple layer of abstraction. So the general thing over here is you want to move up, because the lower level abstractions have less and less, meaning. At some point, you're going to have to come up and describe what you want from the infrastructure. So you can go up, or you can go all the way down. So because we're moving in a way that all our northbound interfaces are coming up, So that's where, there has to be more of an application-centric. That's the general idea, which I think most of the people are bought into that. Nobody's arguing that. The second one is the holistic and unified. Now, this may be little, over time there might be some different implementations, but the good thing about having a holistic is that you're describing, what you need of the infrastructure as a whole. I mean, you can still segment it, based on network, compute, storage if you want, but you're still able to describe as a whole. And the second thing is you're not describing individual elements. So if I am talking about, of a vendor specific, I don't want to go into an abstraction where I say, this vendor has this abstraction. I want to have like a general abstraction for some firewall rules or whatever else, right? The second, this is where the group-based policy would come in as an example, right? The second one is, you want to be able to abstract it in a way that is general. So in a switch, in an open flow, there is already that abstraction is happening, right? When I'm describing a network, subnet and things like that, right? So that's the abstraction. Orchestration, again, I'm not going to go too deep, but that's another, need, right? Because after I describe, I want to be able to, make that, and then the service function chain is a big example over here. And then the open and extensible. So obviously for this, group over here, open is, I'm going to be preaching to the choir, right? But from extensible, I mean, that's a general principle everyone strives for, but in the policy, it's even more important because the use cases are going to be widespread, okay? If you're gonna build a system, I mean, ideally you can build it and it will get so far and then you can say, okay, you know what, I will build on top of it or I'll do something, but if you build it extensible enough, hopefully you have enough of the coverage, right? So that's the general idea, right? And this is the last slide in the high-level overview, the conceptual view I have. So this is based on, some of the internal work we had done before, but, this is just a conceptual idea of what we have come up with. And on the top, and by the way, the one on the right is an example. This is not what we had built, right? I'm just showing which would fit in, right? So on the top, you have a policy service, okay? And the policy service comprises of the policy repository where all the policies are gonna reside. And then you have the policy console where, either it's a UI, API, whatever. It's an interaction where the policies are gonna come in. And then of course, you have the data interface to, make sure the things are happening. And then you have the policy engine itself, which does all the computation. It does, all these other things that we talked about, the negotiation, the stakeholder, all that, right? And then the policy engine then is going to compute what needs to happen and then send in through the API layer into what I call the middle layer, which is the service and device and element manager. So here, all your, element managers or service managers will fit in. So, think of, cloud management platform, all your, storage service, compute service, and it could be also the service manager, like for example, it could be, like a SDN controller. In our case, this is where the OpenStack and also the Open Daylight would come in, right? And on the bottom, you have the infrastructure elements, of course. So this is where finally it's gonna go and, do what you need at the infrastructure. This is the third layer of the, and then the one I want to not miss is, what is happening on the left, right? So it's a feedback loop. The feedback loop is important because, every time you talk about policy, and I will discuss real examples for that, there's going to be a lot of this conditional things, right? There's always going to be like, okay, if this happens, do this, or something like, not all policies are like that. Some policies are going to be pretty, thou shalt do this always or something like that. You are always following that, but a lot of time there are conditions, and conditions it could be external, but it could also be internal to your infrastructure. So something happens in your infrastructure, you want to trigger, a change in your policy, right? So that's where the feedback loop will come in. Okay, so basically that summarizes the first section. Remember I said there was 3. So far, just to quickly recap, just what the conceptual, what I mean by infrastructure policies, where I'm coming from, what are those models that we have used in the past, and so on. So the next is I'm gonna get into examples, and like I said, this is really top of mind. What we come up with, in our real day-to-day life in a real IT environment, right? And it's not a comprehensive set. So anyway, so the resource policy example I have is from a business. It could be a resource policy. I want to meter. So I have multiple departments. I have a shared infrastructure. I want to meter it. And then I want to, bill individual department, and certain things happen, like my my infrastructure usage exceeds certain limit, or there is a threshold, or if there is some underutilized resources, then I want to set something up, right? So that's one. The second one is, infrastructure demarcation. So in my example, we have like, factories, you have, office, you have the design computers, and I want to keep them separate. And there's a business reasons for doing that. There could be security reasons for doing that too, right? So I'm separating those. So that's one example. So then next is the security policy example. So this is where I have spent most of my time in the last 15 years doing this, right? So this is where you get as granular as, okay, I have a 3-tier application, I want to separate each of the layer and only allow certain ports between them. I mean, this is the most common you will see, pretty much anyone talk about segmentation, you will see this use case, right? And then you have like something like, I want to limit my outbound traffic to only specific URLs. This is a real policy that I have in my data center today. And then you said, no matter what the database instances, anything which is running a database should never be exposed over the internet. Okay, so those are just examples, right? And then I have again, going into the if condition, I have a if example, right? So if I find an infected system, right, I want it to be disconnected from the network, right? So how I do it, whether I go physically, disconnect the port from a bare metal system, or I do it, automatically through some kind of automation, or I do it through, an open flow, interface or whatever, right? And the third, another type I have here is the regulatory policy. So these are the most prescriptive, and they need to be auditable. So these are the examples where, for example, the PCI, DSS requirement, you have, cardholder data only, exposed to whoever needs to have access. I mean, they are generic enough, but very, very specific. So, and then there are ways to, audit them, right? Encrypt all the transmission of the cardholder data over any public network. I mean, those are an example, right? The next one is this is becoming more and more common, is the geolocation. So again, I want to be aware of where, my privacy, certain privacy sensitive workload, where I'm going to put it within, a physical boundary of a continent, of a country or whatever, right? So my infrastructure should reside. I will run this workload only if the infrastructure is in this geo, right? Whatever the geolocation is, right? And then I have, going a little bit down into the SFC. So the SFC, you've heard a lot of talk, and how it works with the GPB and all that, right? But here's an example of the use case from real world, right? So I want to make sure, when I say static chain, meaning I'm defining it, beforehand, right? So I want to, all incoming web traffic, I want to go through this to A and B, basically, some reverse proxy firewall, okay? That's my main need, right? But if a malicious activity is detected, so something happens, and I have defined what that if condition is, so something happens, then I want to redirect all the traffic, in addition to those two, to another new service function, and I want to capture, so basically there is something else, maybe it's not a service function, maybe it's another need on the device itself. And then I have a special example for that called the remediation use case, where, so this happens in today's world, right? When something got disconnected, but the forensics team want to know what happened. They want to do a malware analysis on that. Okay, so now, today what I do is I physically disconnect it, or some way to, reconnect it to the malware analytics tools, so the forensics guy can come in and look at, they can take the image, and then they can analyze what happened at the system level, file level, whatever, right? So how about, I create a chain where, if that happened, then I'm going to, disconnect it from this network, everything kind of public network, and I'm going to reconnect it through a private network, back into the forensics tool where it's not available for anything else except for that. So those are just examples, right? And then the next few slides, I'm going to talk about use cases. So far I covered like some examples, again, top of mind examples from different areas, right? So next I'm going to come into the use cases. So use cases I have is, one is a business rule, right? Business rule, again, accept, something from the business requirement and then translate it. And, so one example is least privilege. Remember that PCI DSS requirement, right? So take that, make sure it's enforced, and then make sure the capabilities are there on the network or on your infrastructure and doing it, right? Second is, something happened, there's a degraded mode of operation. So something happened, there's a denial of service attack, something happened in a network. Now you're taking action, right? So that's a degraded mode of operation. The next one is a complex policy enforcement. So it's not just applying policy to one element, but across different vendor, different topologies. You're coming in through a policy interface. You're describing what you want, and then it's based on the policy schema. It's gonna get deployed across multiple diverse elements, right? The next one I have is the high-level abstraction. So this I kind of covered with the abstraction, right? But the idea is, when you're coming in as an administrator, you're able to see, what those things are, right? So the next is the dynamic policy enforcement. So this is adaptive change to the network. Something happens and you detect a threat. You're taking some action, and the policy interface itself should be capable of accepting that, making changes, and then pushing it down, right? And then I have the manager of managers, basically, which is pretty much the conceptual architecture that I shared, right? Where you are not able to describe the policies of all the elements, then you have to go through some sort of a manager, and that's the domain-specific things which will happen. And then you have what I call the domains of constant policy. So this will come as some of the advanced use cases. So far, I covered some simple ones. So this is where you have more than one autonomous domain for an administrator. So you can have an infrastructure which is sliced. Think of it sliced, right? Think of it like a maybe multi-tenant example, but at your infrastructure layer, right? So you should be able to do that, and then role-based access for how you divide your infrastructure. And then you have the policy modeling and visualization. So this is where, what if scenario. So if I wanted to change my policy, I have a lot of things running in my infrastructure. What would happen if I change this? Would it cause any conflict? And I want to see that modeling, and I want to see all that analytics, what happens, before I actually make the change, right? And then you have the conflict resolution that goes without saying, again, the what if scenarios will come in. I kind of covered this, so I'm not gonna go too deep into that. And then you have workflow. So this is my favorite because you're still gonna have workflow requirement for certain things, right? So at the end of the day, things will run by themselves, but there is still gonna be certain needs to have workflow where somebody's gonna come in and make some decisions. It will be much less than what we have today, but there will be some sort of a workflow and change control manual, all that, right? So that pretty much sums up the second section. I went a little fast because there was a lot of things to cover, but hopefully it gives you some idea on like something which we do every day, like real examples and where the policy need to go. So here, again, I'll step back and give you the same, introduction I had before. Is I am coming from the user side of this story, right? So, I mean, Intel, of course, have the engineering arm, where the Intel engineering is involved in the project. They'll be there tomorrow, day after in the design and all that. And, where I'm coming from is the other side, right? So this is, my view basically completely from an end user IT side, right? So far, and I apologize if I missed any project which touches on the policy, but this is what I see so far in the ODL, right? You have the intent. So for those of you who sat in the call, I mean, in the talk before this, you know this, but basically, it is giving you a nice interface, a generalized abstracted view. It can give you, what is desired from the infrastructure versus, how you're doing it. So they are evolving. So that's I think a good work, and that needs to happen because a lot of the use cases I covered, it touches upon this, right? The second one I have is a modeling. So I don't know how many have anyone heard about this? Anyone worked on this, the Nemo, or looked at this? Okay, so anyway, this is a northbound interface. This is a recent work I found over there. And I think this is important for the not just for the abstraction, but also for the modeling. The modeling, remember some of the advanced use cases I talked. Maybe it's kind of a little bit early in terms of where all the other projects are, but maybe it's not. I don't know. I mean, it's still gonna fit in, and it's a very important project. And the group-based policy, I think whenever for ODL, pretty much you already have this as a baseline, there's already there, so I don't have to describe that more. I mean, if you have not heard about group-based policy, basically, in a nutshell, it is really an endpoint group, the contracts and so on and so forth. And then the service function chaining. Again, how do you chain the functions, and then how do you describe, and how do you make sure the exchange of the metadata is happening, right? So having said that, this is kind of like, coming to the pretty much like the so what? right, for this community. So what is, I have like, call out for all ODL projects really, in terms of, what is the future perspective from a, what I call the software-defined intelligence. Okay, so the idea is now the northbound interface and the application, think of them as being consumed by actual applications by policy engines. So make sure that, when we are working on all these, things at the controller layer or anything which is, coming up, make sure that we are keeping that in mind, right? The second thing I have is really, fully program. I mean, this is what SDN is about anyway, but make sure that you have, individual components, individual things that you expose all the way up, because they may not be, needed for certain use cases in the first instance that you're creating it, but as you come to the policy and you have more and more advanced use cases, you want to be able to expose them. I mean, you might not think of, here's why I want to use it, but why would I expose it? But the idea is, at least have that extensibility. And then the third one is, remember that in the conceptual architecture I had where it's a feedback loop. So all the instrumentation, all the things which need to go back and at least have that ability so that your events are flowing out and be able to, I mean, you may not need it again from day one, but be able to have that flow so that it actually can feed into something which is using it for the changed adaptive policies. The next call out I have is for the folks who are working on the policy projects, so like GPB, all this NEMO and intent and all that. So unlike, I mean, this is true for anything, but policy is where it's so vast and so broad and it's so specific to different organizations. This is why having any conversation on policy is so hard, right? Because it's one thing to someone, is another thing to someone else. If you go talk to a service provider, operations, if you go talk to an IT information security guy, you'll hear different things and different use cases, right? So I think that dialogue with the people who have been doing this for many, many years is important, right? So I think this is why maybe it takes longer, but you're coming with that angle, right? The second is open and extensible. I kind of covered that, and then the third one I have is, I think you saw this in maybe, I don't know how many of you attended Uri's talk and a lot of other places where this has come up, right? Is policy is going to be, it's going to go outside of just ODL. I mean, it's not going to just be limited to ODL, right? So be involved in those dialogues. I mean, you may not be contributing code there, but be involved, know what's going on so that you are coming up with the right model and framework with those, right? And then, so I have kind of like this, the end, the policy has always been associated with infrastructure. It's nothing new. It's a next evolution. And then, obviously ODL has an important role because we're coming in as the controller for the network. So, we have a responsibility for as far as the policy is concerned, right? So, and then I have this, the journey has begun because as you can see, a lot of the projects in the policy are still in their, early stages, right? So I'm just, for ourselves, be ready for the next phase, right? So I think that's all I have, and I have about 15 minutes. So one request I have is, if you guys can put the questions on the mic, if you don't mind. So any questions? No? Is this kind of something that anyone is working on in general as a policy? Is this trigger some of the work changes? I mean, not changes, but the work that you already done, or?
But what I'm saying is that we also have the same thing that in Brocade, we have to start working on the policy infrastructure that is here.
You have some, I'm sorry?
Yeah, I'm working for Brocade Communications, and we also have to start working on the policy infrastructure.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, actually we also have been thinking about the same problems and issues and everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically it's like more like resonating in terms of like a top level
definitely.
at least. Okay, yeah. Okay, if no other question, then I'll let you guys go. It's pretty much the end of the day anyway, so I don't want to keep you from. Okay, thank you so much. Thanks. You're running the infrastructure. There is always rules, business rules, logic, business logic, security requirements, what have you, right? Have always been associated with infrastructure. And so far what has happened is humans, they're interpreting, this is so far happening today, right? You're interpreting them and then you're applying them to the infrastructure individual elements, right? And then the third part, which is really important part of policy, is you're doing manual governance and audit for compliance. And again, I'll get into real examples for those. But the idea is, this is not a foreign concept. It's like, it's not coming out of nowhere, right? So we have been doing this for many, many years. So this is, from my view, this is kind of like how I see the path the infrastructure is taking. So, even my own experience, last 15 years, maybe 15 years ago, I saw most of the workload was happening, bare metal. You're building you're building the network, you're connecting something, you're building the operating system, you're running the application, installing the application, running the application, developing it. You're managing each of these individually and so on and so forth, right? From there, we went into, reason I'm calling this current is pretty much, at least from my world, this is where I'm mostly at. I'm moving on to the next one, which is software defined, but the current is the whole virtualization and cloud, right? Over here, the two important things happen, right? One is a self-service, right? So suddenly, think of this, from the context of policy as we come into next level, right? Suddenly now you have the need for, the self-service. So the operations person or team or somebody who was in the loop for doing some part of the infrastructure provisioning or doing whatever, right? It's getting, automated and becoming in. So that was one of the structure for the virtualization and the cloud, right? The second thing is, from a security perspective, you will always hear this, right? Hey, virtualization cloud, how do you secure? There's like so many angles to it, but from a security perspective, it somewhat made job harder for the security, and I'll get into examples for that, right? And then the current, what we're doing right now with ODL, with OpenStack, the whole community is working on the software defined, right? Okay, I think I'm gonna start now. So, thanks for joining. I know this is like the last day, last session of the day. So thanks for sticking around. So my name is Manish Dave, and the topic here is on policies. So this is, as the topic suggests, getting real with policies. So it's more on the use cases, and from an end user perspective, and I'll walk through what I'm going to talk about. So a little bit about myself. I've been with Intel IT. So I'm from the IT organization, the user side of the part of the ODL, or actually for the whole thing, not from the engineering side. I just want to call out that part, right? So, overall, my work has been mostly focused on network security for many, many years. But recently doing, a lot of work for our internal cloud transformation, right? And, some of my areas of interest, I can, talk about. One is, obviously the software defined, maybe at some point we'll do that. But this was just top of mind, what I can think of from a enterprise IT perspective, right? And then the third section is more about, what is happening. So the talk before this, you saw the intent, right? And then there's other work happening. I will cover a little bit of that. But more importantly, where I think, the community need to focus and where I see, that work need to happen. Again, coming from my perspective as an end user, right? So having said that, so let me start with the first section. So why infrastructure policy? So basically, infrastructure policies have always existed. This is where I'm coming from, right? So they have always existed. The business logic and policies have always been there for infrastructure, and I'll get into real examples for that. But idea is, the infrastructure is not itself an end; it's a means to an end, right? Your end of the day, even if you're an infrastructure provider, you're running because of revenue or whatever, right? If you're an application, if you're a business, then the second one is self-service governance and policy management. So I've done some work on these areas. There's some internal work we had done, and this is what basically today's talk is based on the experience that I had from there. And then there's a granular-based trust policy. You can look it up. There's some other work we have done. And then here's my email and things like that. So basically, I'm going to cover it's this into 3 sections. The first section is going to be, the background on why infrastructure policies, what do they mean, from an end user perspective, why we use them and how they are implemented today. Okay. The second one is going to be, more about real world use cases. So this is going to be examples of policies that we are implementing that are required. And again, I try to capture as many as I can to get a glimpse of the whole thing, but just to clarify, these are more top of mind kind of use cases and examples, not meant to be a comprehensive, even though I think of, maybe that's a interesting work would be for the community.